Everyone, I'm Gretchen Ritter, Executive Dean and Vice Provost for the College of Arts and Sciences at OSU, and I'm pleased to be with you all today for this conversation as we seek to understand the outcome and implications of the 2020 presidential election. With us today are 4 distinguished faculty members from the College of Arts and Sciences who will offer a few introductory reflections on the implications of the election for some key areas of concern, including the future of the political parties, the movement for racial justice, efforts to address climate change, and the response to the pandemic. Many have seen the 2020 election as critical, some even suggesting that it is perhaps the most consequential election of our lifetimes. Politically, this election was marked by extremely high levels of participation, as well as by deep levels of political polarization. The commitment to a peaceful transition of power still remains to be resolved. There are divisions and challenges as well for the 2 main political parties, calling the future of the party system and our electoral structure into some question. The election also occurred in the midst of a pandemic. To date, the COVID-19 virus has infected over 10 million Americans, killing over 240,000. On Wednesday alone, over 140,000 new infections were reported across the country. With infections surging, one key issue is what the election means for public health concerns. At the same time, the US and every other nation is contending with the impact of climate change. The scientific consensus tells us that we are already experiencing some of the most damaging impacts of climate change, including rising sea levels, deadlier storms, extreme heat, droughts, floods, and wildfires. Will our approach to managing climate change with a new administration? Finally, the election also occurred in the midst of a moment of racial reckoning for our nation. Following the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor last spring, and in the midst of what the FBI reports is a significant growth in affiliation with white nationalist groups nationally, the movement for racial justice has emerged nationwide. Some 150 years after the end of slavery and 50 years after the conclusion of the civil rights movement, we are still endeavoring to live up to our ideals of equality and opportunity for all Americans. What will the impact of the election be, including with the inauguration of our first woman of color as vice president? How are we to make sense then of all of these issues and what their implications are for the party system, for racial justice, for climate change, and efforts to manage the COVID epidemic? Those are the topics our panelists will help us to address today. I'll introduce them now in alphabetical order, which is also the order in which they will speak. Following their brief presentations, we'll broaden the discussion. I'll open with a couple of initial questions from me, and then we'll turn to your questions. So I encourage you to share those in the Q&A chat feature at the bottom of your screens. And now our panelists. We will hear first from Paul Beck, Professor Emeritus of the Department of Political Science. He is currently an Academy Professor of Political Science at OSU and co-coordinator of the Comparative National Election Project, which has now conducted election surveys in 54 elections across the world. Next, we will hear from Professor Korie Edwards, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, where she studies race and ethnicity, the sociology of religion, social stratification, as well as gender. Our third presenter will be Ian Howat, who is a professor of earth sciences, a distinguished university scholar, and the director of Ohio State's Bird, Polar, and Climate Research Center. And then our final presenter will be Professor Elisabeth Root, who is professor of geography as well as public health, where she studies human health and disease, disease ecology, and global public health. So I hope you enjoy the presentations, and I look forward to the discussion in the second part of our webinar. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Beck.
Hello, everybody. I am glad to be a part of this and glad to greet all of these alums and friends of the arts and sciences at Ohio State University. There's several features of the 2020 election that come immediately to mind, and I'd like to share a few of them with you. The first is that our electoral machinery in 2020 faced unprecedented challenges. The pandemic, the record number of votes cast overall and as absentee ballots, the close contests in key battleground states, and the spirited contestation of the results by the losing party. Despite them, it is remarkable that the election and vote counting was carried out so effectively, and with only rare documented irregularities. Most states are approaching the deadlines for counting ballots and reporting the official vote. Ohio's is this Friday, ominously Friday the 13th, of course. So at least this phase will soon be over in most, though not all, places. That the voting process was handled so well is a tribute to the bipartisan, and I emphasize bipartisan, election officials for whose expertise, professionalism under duress, and dedication we should be grateful. The second feature that came to mind is that once again, the results highlighted the difference between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. Biden won the popular vote by more than 4%. It's actually climbing towards 5%, and by over 5 million total votes. But his margin in the Electoral College will probably end up being about the same as Trump's was back in 2016. More or less 303 Electoral College votes to 235. His may go up a few more, but that's kind of the ballpark that they're going to be in. If slightly more than 62,000 votes had switched from Biden to Trump in Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, Trump would have been reelected. That's the impact of the Electoral College and its impact on the popular vote. A third point that I want to share with you is that the overarching message coming out of 2020 is that the country remains deeply divided, more deeply polarized than probably ever before. Democrats voted 94% for Biden nationwide. Republicans voted 94% for Trump nationwide, according to the exit polls. And more disturbingly, the divisions are deeper than just the vote. Partisans see the political world through partisan lenses, with their partisanship driving not only the positions they take on issues and candidates, but also what they believe about matters of fact. If Republicans are able to hang on to their majority in the Senate, it is likely that this polarization will play out in coming battles between the Senate on the one hand and the House and the President on the other. This divided government may produce conflicts over appointments to the federal courts and the executive branch leadership, over the federal budget, over a stimulus package and attempts to deal with COVID moving forward. It also will lead to partisan tensions between Republican-led states and the federal government. A fourth point that I want to share with you, and this is thinking forward, it will be interesting to see how much the parties are remade by recent years and recent elections. Will the Republicans be a Trump party, or will they return to the party of the Mitt Romneys? My bet is that Trump will continue to shape the GOP, but we, of course, will see what happens going forward. On the Democratic side, will the Democrats be more in a Democratic centrist Biden mode, or will pressures from activists on the left for more progressive policies shape the Democratic future. The need to deal with a Republican Senate, if it is to be a Republican Senate, I think, will tilt the balance more toward the center among the Democrats. But again, we will see. This is yet to be played out. Amidst all of this, I see several hopeful signs. It's been a difficult campaign in 2020, and so there are some things thinking forward that we should be hopeful about. First, President-elect Biden may be better able to forge agreements across the partisan divide than other Democrats might have been. Secondly, the powerful presidential megaphone that promoted so much divisiveness during the last 4 years will not be as strong, nor will it be as polarizing. Third, and partly a result of this, the temperature of the country, especially its partisans, may cool down. Moreover, Americans may simply be worn out by the partisan strife, eager to return to their day-to-day lives and challenges, especially once we get beyond the pandemic. Politics may not loom so large or occupy so much of our attention under those circumstances. It's hard for a political scientist and election specialist to say that, but most people don't pay attention to politics all the time, and I think we'll be refreshed by being able to move on to other concerns and other thoughts. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Beck. And next we will turn to Professor Edwards.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here with everyone, even though we're virtually together. With this election, we have witnessed some critical firsts. The first woman vice president-elect after 3 women on the ticket as vice presidential or presidential candidates. Not only do we have the first woman, we have the first Black woman and the first person of South Asian descent. So regardless of your politics, we must pause and recognize the importance of this. And personally, as a Black woman, Vice President-elect Harris's election is affirming. And it simply feels good, and it does make me happy. And that feeling, I imagine, is something that other women and girls who share similar life experiences are also feeling in this moment. But regarding what the election means for racial justice, well, we have to look beyond the election of first. We do have commitments from the president and vice president-elect to address systemic racism. Biden, Harris, and other political figures are now speaking out about and proclaiming the reality of systemic racism and racial injustice. And we're hearing that even with our local Franklin County government. People are not just talking about individual racism, but systemic racism. When people with a voice speak truth about the systemic racism and hurt of the voiceless, that matters, no doubt. But we do not yet have action. And it is action that is required to generate systemic change and systemic justice. And by action, I'm speaking of change laws and policies, as well as changes in our informal, often unspoken norms and values that we take for granted, those things we hold dear. A second and critically important point that Professor Beck already brought up is this. This election sharply reveals that the United States is a deeply divided country. And this divide is racially driven, but it is also religiously driven. A reality that has actually organized America since before it was, well, formerly America. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a reverend, and who, by the way, majored in sociology as an undergraduate student at Morehouse College, he and other reverends led the struggle for freedom and justice 60 years ago during the Jim Crow era in a moment similar to what we have today, a moment that demanded what he regularly referred to as a fierce urgency of now. But there was one group that King had earnestly hoped would not only understand the urgency of the moment at that time, but partner with him and other reverends in the struggle to spread the gospel of freedom and justice. And those people were the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of that day. Instead, King found himself in 1963 sitting in a dingy jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, admittedly disappointed, perhaps even a bit despondent, responding to a letter from a group of white religious leaders who referred to the nonviolent resistance of civil rights movement participants as unwise and untimely. None too pleased at the campaign for change that had emerged in Birmingham in 1963, these ministers made their voice known in a letter. And they declared, "We respectfully urge those who strongly oppose desegregation to pursue their convictions in the courts. And in the meantime, peacefully to abide by the decisions of those same courts." They further asserted that we do not believe that these days of new hope are days when extreme measures are justified in Birmingham. Pointing out a flaw in these white ministers' plea, King says, "You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstration. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative." This racial and religious divide about American justice, or the lack thereof, persists today. For sure, the Black Lives Matter protests that emerged in 2012 and spread across the globe earlier this year are not new. They are the continuation of a struggle for freedom that has been going on for centuries. What this moment, this election, allows us to see more clearly is where the divisions lie in our society, to see the truth of ourselves as a nation. And that matters because seeing the truth is a first critical step toward justice. Thank you. Look forward to your question.
Thank you, Professor Edwards. And next we will hear from Professor Howat.
Well, thanks a lot for having me today. I'm not a political scientist. I'm a climate scientist. I'm a glaciologist. So I don't know a whole lot about how the government will exist, will function in the future. But I have some large scale or broad perspectives on what I see coming up in climate science that will be different in the past, what we see in the past 4 years. And really what we'll see, I think, is kind of a return to the programs that we saw under the Obama administration. And a lot of the announcements we've seen in the past few days, and as Biden begins to formulate his plans, really reflect that. He's bringing on many of the same people that were in that administration. And I think the things that are obvious, no matter how the Senate goes, would be re-engagement with the international community. I mean, most clearly through rejoining the Paris Agreement that we just officially dejoined a few days ago. And so this is an international problem. You know, carbon dioxide doesn't stay over a single country. So international cooperation and engagement is critical. It's been virtually non-existent for the past 4 years. So that's a clear one. Another one, I think, will be the fact that we will visibly mitigate and prepare for climate change throughout the government. Over the past 4 years, there has been preparations and mitigation for climate change, but it's been behind the scenes. But most notably in the US military, where funding for climate change research and mitigation technologies are actually has climbed quite a bit over the past 4 years. But in terms of political appointments, like say through the EPA, the visible part of government, we haven't seen that. So I think we'll see it throughout government. We'll see this acceptance of climate change, for example, in terms of preventing another round of forest fires like we had this year. I think in the next 4 years, we're actually going to see a stronger emphasis, or really an acceptance, a greater acceptance in the US around the idea of climate justice and the impact of climate change on inequality. This is something that even under the Obama administration, we didn't really hear about because it was a new concept. This is something that's become clearer and clearer as the impacts of climate change are being seen and felt. And so I think this is going to be kind of grow in the consciousness of our society. And I think in terms of controlling emissions, really at this point, depending on how the Senate goes, it's going to be much about letting current trends continue and helping them along rather than preventing them. So I'm talking here about trends in low or no emissions energy technology and the lowering cost of those technologies, such as renewable energies. We've seen a dramatic increase in their efficiency and a reduction in their costs as part of economies of scale. And so promoting that and letting that grow and letting that kind of economic force, that headwind, or removing the headwind from that economic force is what I'm hopeful of seeing. I mean, in terms of large scale government action, things like greater regulations on emissions, large scale economic programs like a cap and trade, carbon control system, that's really going to take the will of the Senate. And as we've heard, that's right now the big wild card, not only in terms of the outcome of this race, the races that are still pending, but also how a Republican controlled Senate would cooperate with the Biden administration.
Thank you, Professor Howat. And then our last presenter is Professor Elisabeth Root.
Hello, everybody. With COVID cases skyrocketing around the country, it's clear that we still have some pretty major hurdles to overcome. In particular, I think the politicization of the COVID-19 response and the widespread misinformation about the disease has been quite problematic and hampered many of our efforts to date. Infectious diseases are unique, especially newly emerged novel viruses like the one that causes COVID-19, because no one has immunity and everyone is at risk of contracting the disease. COVID doesn't respect geographic boundaries or social class, age, or gender. To be honest, I have been disheartened and challenged throughout the COVID crisis so far to see how COVID-19 has been used as a political weapon and how rhetoric has led to threats against public health officials, including our own Dr. Amy Acton, in a time when we need them the most, and how basic public health guidelines such as mask wearing and social distancing have become political statements rather than ways to protect ourselves and our families and our communities. Much of this is related to the attack on science, but I am hopeful that in the next administration will work toward restoring public faith in science and promoting the use of science and policies around COVID-19 and our response. And I have faith that as this happens, as we have science-based and constructive response to the pandemic, and that as people see that we can control this pandemic and keep people safe, that there will be a lessening of the politics and a strengthening of the adherence to public health recommendations and guidelines. But I believe that this politicization of the pandemic has also led me to understand how important scientific communication is. I believe that more support is necessary for scientists as they become educators who can speak with our communities instead of to our communities. And related to this, public health messaging is a clear need. A public relations campaign that's grounded in communication science, which helps people understand the risks of COVID-19, how they can modify their behaviors, and really provides a unified message for us to stand behind about the pandemic. And I believe that the incoming administration understands the importance of messaging and the importance of a unified message coming from our major health agencies like the CDC and HHS. I believe that they will further that agenda. We do need to understand how people view the pandemic as it relates to their well-being and their own self-interest. And the messaging that is crafted should address these concerns. And there's people who are trained in this, in risk messaging, and we haven't used much of this expertise to date. I see it here in Ohio, but I also see it around the US. So looking forward, I'm optimistic that the new administration will champion a federal coordinated response, which includes testing, vaccine development and deployment, and workforce development, and also investment in federal, state, and local public health workforce and infrastructure. They've published a comprehensive plan, which you can go online and read. They've appointed a strong group of medical and public health professionals already to oversee the response to the pandemic, and they seem to understand what's needed to get control of this pandemic. This will include, according to their plan, a coordinated and comprehensive set of guidelines and recommendations from the CDC, which our state, local, and even school district partners have lacked up until this point. The CDC has really been silenced so far, and so I think that will happen rapidly because I believe that they've been doing the work and it's ready for somebody to take it on. I think this will help schools to know what to do. Local health departments will have better ideas, and even our business partners that really dearly want to keep businesses open and are willing to make some sacrifices to make that happen. The plan has actually also suggested something called a Public Health Service Reserve Corps, which is sort of like an AmeriCorps for the public health workforce. And this is an excellent way to expand quickly public health capacity and provide jobs and employment to people who may need employment at this time. We also really need to figure out testing capacity and how to improve it. And one of the big issues is that materials are a problem. Much of the stuff that we get, the reagents and the test, the pieces of the test that we need to run the labs actually come from international locations, and everybody's fighting for it around the world. So I'm hopeful that in this plan, there's a new administration development of harnessing American-sourced and manufactured pharmaceutical and medical supplies so that we can really address the testing issue across the US. There's also very clear signals, if you've read the news over the last few days, that we have a viable vaccine candidate from Pfizer, which is extraordinarily positive news for all of us. I believe that the new administration is working on and has a plan to disseminate and roll out that vaccine as it is available, so that it's intelligently and equitably distributed, because it will be limited at first. And last, I'd end by saying and pointing out that the Biden administration's COVID-19 plan has a focused portion that directly addresses racial disparities. It involves all of the points that I've discussed, testing and vaccination and the Public Health Reserve Corps, but it clearly targets and understands that communities of color, low-income communities have diverse needs and experiences that need to be directly addressed, not sort of sidelined in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Those were great initial comments from everyone, and I see that we've got some terrific questions coming in as well. Let me start off by asking our panelists to speak to a couple of questions. One of them is about expertise. I mean, you've all referenced this in various ways, or it's relevant to some of the things that you've talked about. In this moment of deep polarization, the role of expertise has come into serious question. Professor Beck talked about the fact that people have different sets of facts that they work from. We know with regard to racial justice issues that there's deep dispute over the nature of racial disparities and structural racism. We know with regard to climate change that many Americans are doubtful about the nature or causes of climate change. We know, of course, with the COVID epidemic, we see lots of folks doubting the efficacy of things like mask wearing, and really deep doubts about whether or not they ought to get a vaccine when one becomes available. I think this is an important question for us politically. I also think it's an important question for us in higher education, since so much of what we do and the impact of our work depends upon a public interest in expertise. So I'd love for your comments on that. Okay, I'm going to call on you. Paul.
Well, maybe I could start as the non-scientist in a way in this group. I think we have been in an unfortunate period in America and maybe other countries as well, where disinformation has been so widespread to lead people doubt expertise, to lead people to think that there maybe is not such a thing as truth or factual matters. We need to work very hard, both as educators and as a society, to get beyond that, because the kinds of problems we're facing right now can't be solved by belief alone. They need to be solved by concentrating expertise on these problems and bringing the public along to be convinced that this expertise is going to help us be able to deal with what are very profound problems that we are facing as a society, not just in 2020, but going forward over the next decades.
Elisabeth, this is an issue that you called out. What are your thoughts? You have to unmute.
I thought I was unmuted, apparently not. I mean, so I concur. There has been this dialogue or this discussion that there isn't truth, right? That somehow the numbers that we're using to try to plan public health interventions around COVID-19 are fudged. And in fact, sometimes working with the Ohio Department of Health, we've been told we're lying with the numbers. And yes, there are ways of lying with statistics, but this default to believing that we're not being truthful with the data or the information we have is challenging and concerning. And this is one of the reasons I really believe that science communication is vital. Because clearly it's not just that people don't know, like they're not educated in the data or the numbers or whatnot. I mean, that is true. There's lots of people who this isn't their life work, this isn't their expertise, and that's fine. We don't all need to be experts in everything, but we clearly need to communicate what we're doing, our expertise, in a better way to engender trust. And we're not doing that well enough right now. And so I think that to me is the big thing, is how do we trust again in the science and the data and the numbers?
Korie, do you have thoughts about this?
Yeah, I do actually. You know, there's a book by a sociologist by the name of Elaine Howard Eklund called Why Science and Faith Need Each Other. And, you know, it's a really important book, because what I think we don't often talk about is, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is that religion is a part of some of this dialogue and this narrative. And also that these are things that really matter to people, right? That they hold these ideas about how the world is supposed to work, and it's dear to them. So I think there's a bit of a balance. It's about recognizing that knowledge is just knowledge, and what you do with knowledge, that's another thing. But knowledge is knowledge, and it is valuable and it is important. And if we're going to move forward, we need to understand and accept knowledge and accept the truth. And that comes out of looking at data and the kind of rigorous analysis and studies that we do as social scientists and other scientists as well. But I also think that there is another side of recognizing where some of this comes from, and how do we bring people into the conversation about why science is so critical, why it's so important. Why is it that this is not in contradiction to values or beliefs that you have, but rather it is aligned with that in many ways. And so I think if we can begin to have some dialogue in that way, we can find some common ground where people who are concerned about it, there may be some inroads for us to begin to show how it's important and it matters to them as well.
Thank you. And Ian?
Yeah, one thing we've struggled for decades with in climate-related science, and really any science, but for some reason it's most prominent in climate, I think, is this concept of uncertainty and how to share predictions, expertise, the results of our science, and also convey accurately the uncertainty that goes along with it in a way that is understandable to the general public we don't deal with uncertainty in our daily lives, right? We go to our bank account, there's an uncertain range in how much is in our savings account, but we generally know how much is going to be there. We know what the weather is generally tomorrow, with an uncertainty that's actually pretty large here in Ohio. But when we talk about 20, 30, 50, 100 years in the future and that growing cone of uncertainty, it's harder for people to grasp. And even it's hard for us scientists. I mean, that's something we struggle with, and rigorous science is about getting knowledge, but understanding the limits of that knowledge and what the error bars are. And so communicating our results and how those results can be used and should be used and interpreted is key. And also really hammering in the difference between skepticism and denial. I mean, science should be skeptical. Everyone who gets information should be skeptical of that information. They should make sure they understand the source, the methods used to get that information. Is it corroborated between multiple sources, just like a journalist would do? So it's great to be skeptical. You should be skeptical of everything you hear, but it can't be selective. So you can't hear something on one news channel that you might listen to once in a while and hear something and say, I don't believe it. That's some scientist telling me something. I'm skeptical of that. And then go to your favorite news channel that you always listen to, and one pundit tells you something, and I'm going to believe that because it's more agreeable to me. So that's I guess that's my perspective on expertise.
I have a lot more.
If I may,
Go
I
ahead.
just wanted to bring this back quickly to my domain, which is the world of politics. I would always teach my students when I taught the American government course that politics deals with the most intractable problems. All the other problems we could solve without bringing them into the political arena. And we now have a series of very intractable problems. And what we should expect of our leaders is that they deal with these problems, even where they disagree, in a way that is fact-based, in a way that kind of sharpens the alternative and allows us as voters to choose which of those alternatives is most attractive to us. So in some ways comes back to our politics and how well our politics is handling these kinds of challenges. And the truth is, it's not handling them very well.
So I have a lot of other questions I would love to ask you all, but I want to turn it over to our audience now. And we have many great questions here. I'm going to, and many of them are specific to various of you. So I'm going to kind of start off by asking one of each of you from these questions, and then we'll go from there. So, Paul, a lot of folks want to know how it is that the pollsters got it so wrong.
Did he freeze?
I think he's frozen. Okay, we're going to come back to that question then. And then, Korie, we'll start with you instead. We have folks who are asking you to kind of help us think a little bit more about what are some of the laws or policies that would help us to successfully address systematic racism. And another question is, how much is culture part of that story?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll go ahead and start with the latter. I really think that we have to recognize that we have, and when we talk about having a divided country that's driven both racially and religiously, we have separate sets of culture. And this has been talked about for a while now, right? We talk about the culture wars, and we continue to see this developing over decades. And so what we're seeing is that people are having different sets of values, different sets of ideas about what's important, how they want the country to run, what's important for their families. what's important for their neighborhoods, and so people and how they understand these. And so when we think about culture and how we can get to a place where we can have a unifying culture, there has to be some way in which we are bringing these ideas together, where people are being, in sociology, we talk about being socialized in the same spheres. One of the challenges I see is that we're seeing more and more people getting their information from separate institutions, separate spheres, and that is not helpful. And so as we move forward, we need to find a way to bring people together and getting information, the same type of information, or same types in the same way. What kinds of laws? I think the first thing, we know right now we have something immediate in the House, and we don't know if it'll go to the Senate as it relates to crime and the police. There needs to be some legislation, major legislation across the country, but also we have to keep in mind at the state and local level that is dealing with this issue of violence against Black people and brown people, particularly of people who are representatives of the state. And so that can be addressed with laws and policies. And we need to do that. We need to do that with vigor. I would say, hopefully, right off the bat. And so we will see, as I said, that action needs to take place, not just a commitment to systemic racism, but action. And another reason why I want to mention something as well is that, we know that we have a Democratic vice president and president-elect that's just been elected. But you can't put all your eggs in that basket. I think about President Bill Clinton, where he signed into law temporary assistance for needy families and got rid of AFDC, right? And that really had a negative impact on poorer families in this country, as well as families of color. And so we need to pay attention to not only things as it relates to the police, as it relates to mass incarceration, as it relates to violence that the state can execute on citizens, but we also have to pay attention to how resources are distributed to families, particularly poor families, which are disproportionately people of color and often headed by women. So I would say those are two places where we can start, and that can happen not only at the national level, but at the state level and the local level.
Paul, the question I was queuing up when you got frozen there a moment ago was, we've got a few folks wanting to know, how did the pollsters get it so wrong?
So ask that question again, please.
How did the pollsters get it so wrong?
Okay, there are a lot of reasons for that, and I think we will find out more of them. Maybe to say in an overarching way, we shouldn't be so dependent on the polls to tell us what's going on. And I think that there was a tendency for people on both sides to sort of cherry pick the polls. If one came along that they really liked, they were trumpeting that. So people were very excited, for instance, when one of the polls in Wisconsin showed that Biden was going to win by 18 points in Wisconsin. Well, the truth is that was nonsense. And anybody who was an expert knew that it was nonsense. But indeed, they got it wrong. One of the things that has hit the polling industry that has been very problematic for them is that people are less and less likely to want to answer questions, either over the phone or through the internet or whatever. Response rates to these polls have gone down dramatically. And that means the polls, after they have asked the questions of samples of people, they have to then correct those samples of people to try to make them representative of the whole country or the whole state. And those corrections are very, very challenging. And they got it wrong in 2016, many of the polls. They got it wrong again, I think, many of the polls in 2020. Some of them were right on target, by the way. But on the whole, they were off. And they led us to believe that the election was going to be very different than it turned out to be, for reasons I could go into in depth, but you don't want to hear all of that. But there are reasons, and the scientists who do the polling are going to spend the next year trying to figure out what happened. Why did we not do so well? They did that after the 2016 election. They'll do it again after this election. Back in 2016, they made some corrections that really should have solved their problems. But of course, you're always fighting the last war, right? And not the war that is coming up. And there are new problems that cropped up. in 2020 that they will have to attend to.
So Ian, I'm going to turn to you. Among the questions that are coming your way is a question of, are we at the tipping point? And also a question about to what degree is there a scientific consensus that the wildfires that we've been experiencing the last couple of years are in part caused by climate change?
Okay, so tipping points. First of all, I think it's really important that there is to understand there is no tipping point. There's a series of tipping points. The climate system, of course, is incredibly complex. It involves the motion of heat from the atmosphere into the ocean and melting ice and then heating up the land. And it's really heat just bouncing around and trying to predict how each system is going to react to forcing is extremely difficult. And that's where that uncertainty comes in. So what we do as scientists is we try and understand these systems as best we can and look for sensitivities. What part of the system should be sensitive to another? And so I study ice sheets. I'm looking for the tipping point at which the ice will suddenly melt and put its mass into the ocean and raise sea level at a much faster rate than even what we've seen. So for example, we've had sea level rise now over the past century of 20 centimeters, so it's 6 inches or so. We are that kind of like a plane taking off, the trajectory of that rise is increasing slowly, and that's just due to melting more heat. We can predict pretty well how the atmosphere is going to continue to melt that ice and how we're going to go up and up and up with the rate of sea level rise. The tipping point comes in when something happens to those ice sheets that makes them discharge their ice into the ocean even faster, that you put down the throttle. And that happens in these big ice sheets down like in Antarctica, big glaciers that go right into the ocean where the ocean meets the ice. That's where we're looking for a tipping point in the glacial system, in the ice sheet system. And that's because over the past 50 years of rapid greenhouse warming, a lot of the extra heat that the atmosphere has absorbed has gone into the ocean. The ocean's a big heat bank. Okay, the air takes in a little heat, the ocean takes in a lot of heat. And there's a lot of missing heat in the ocean. There's enough extra heat in the ocean that's been absorbed to give us right now 1.5 meters of sea level rise. But it's just hanging out there. We don't know when that heat is going to make it to the ice sheet and start melting ice rapidly and then trigger all these dynamic effects like dominoes that can send ice into the ocean. So that's a tipping point that I'm looking for. But atmospheric scientists are looking for tipping point in, say, monsoons when those will kind of go into supercharge, and hurricanes, that's another one. There's all kinds of tipping points. We are used to thinking about this 2-degree limit we're trying to stay under. This is a useful thing for kind of getting everybody on the same page towards a common goal. But when we look at individual things in the climate system, precipitation in Ohio, for example, and the huge amount of rainfall that we've had in the past couple of years, this is something that could be part of a tipping point. We don't know. The forest fire question, I would have to get back to you on that. I'm not an expert in that part of the science. Warming in general is the recent warming trends are largely attributed to anthropogenic, to human forced warming. And this is a part of that. And also the drought trends. But I don't know, and I don't think the scientists might know quite yet if the forest fires this year, how much of that were caused by warming. There was a third part in there.
No, those two. So Elisabeth, I'm gonna queue up 2 things that have emerged in the questions for you. One is about this trade-off that has been articulated between fighting the pandemic and a negative impact of shutting down the economy, and ask you to kind of respond to that perception of a trade-off, and then how do you talk to folks who are concerned about that?
Yes.
And then the second one, which I also find really interesting, compelling, which has to do with this discussion of expertise too, is to point out that part of the doubt about the vaccine and whether or not people should take it of course, has been fueled by a lot of educated elites who are um, uh, raising concerns about vaccinations in other areas. What does this tell us, and how do we contend with that?
Very good questions, both. So the economic question is a really important one. I think the problem is from the very beginning, there's been two groups of people that have been speaking about COVID and the economy as separate things, right? That if we work to combat COVID transmission, we have to sacrifice the economy and vice versa. And what the viewpoint that has not been articulated, but I know is being discussed among health economists, is that the health of the population is intimately linked with the health of the economy. You cannot have a healthy economy when you don't have a healthy population, and vice versa. And so we need to think of these as actually coupled systems, that if we let COVID get out of control, we reduce worker productivity, which harms the economy. We also reduce consumer confidence, which is what gets people out and spending money at restaurants or malls or bars or whatnot. So the more unhealthy our population is, the more harm it actually does to our economy. And that's actually the argument that I would make, that we need to think of these as coupled systems. On the flip side, I personally don't think that the new administration is going for a shut down the economy approach. Like, that's nowhere indicated in anything that Biden or Harris have said in their plans. Because, you know, people still do need to go to work. We need to buy our groceries. We need our children to go to school. There are things that need to continue, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so we need to carefully think about, how do we balance health and economic opportunity? And I do think that it's going to be necessary to prop up, in particular, individual income and business income in a shorter time frame, so that people don't have to go to work when they're sick, right? But I think we can't decouple this conversation, that we have to understand that the health of the population and the health of the economy are two systems that work together with each other, not against one another. So the second one is about doubt about vaccines and vaccine denial, which we're going to go to climate denial, as Ian pointed out. And this is a challenge. This is one of those near intractable problems that public health has been dealing with for the last 10 years. And clearly we have not been super successful, because the level of vaccine compliance has actually gone down over the last 15 years. Not just in the United States, but around the world, including in many of the less developed countries. So, I mean, I sort of go back to this: we need to engender trust in the population, that the vaccine is valid, that is well tested and tried and true, and that it is safe. Rushing it, unfortunately, is not going to engender that trust. So that's going to be important. I think, you know, clearly reviewing the data and the evidence about its efficacy and its how useful it is, and widely, you know, not with one small group of people that we're expected to trust, but widely across the scientific community, is going to be very important as well. And again, targeted public health campaigns at very specific populations with specific concerns about vaccines. That needs to be integrated into the strategy as we roll out the vaccine.
Okay, I'm going to turn next to a question for all of you. This question is, in this moment of depolarization, what policy initiatives do you suspect can begin the long process of bringing the nation together? What might the Biden administration pursue in the first 100 days?
I'm actually thinking that one place to start would be with infrastructure, which would jolt the economy in a positive way, probably can get buy-in from both Democrats and Republicans. There'll be a lot of haggling over how expensive the projects should be. But I think that's one place to go. I thought the Trump administration was inching in that direction. It met resistance from some of the Republicans, and I think probably had other priorities, and so they moved away from infrastructure. But that's one place we should think about, and I think about almost from the beginning.
Other comments, suggestions?
So I agree with Professor Beck. I think this that putting resources towards employment and however you do it, maybe he mentions infrastructure, but this public health service corps that Biden recommended in his plan is another way of doing that, right? Bolstering the public health infrastructure and the public health workforce is another way. I think there's lots of avenues for that, and they could simultaneously address things like climate change, like racial inequities, like COVID, but also produce jobs, which seems to be a huge concern to one portion of the electorate. And so I think this is an avenue forward, and it's going to take a little time. Everything's going to take a little time, but you could start it in that first 100 days, and it would have a pretty visceral, immediate impact, I think.
I see coming together in terms of renewable energy. I think the economics of it now makes sense to the point where it can translate on both sides of the aisle. So traditional Democrats worrying about with their issues of climate change in itself, and then the Republican side worrying about the economics in terms of job growth, the potential for jobs and for improving local economies. This gets something that can be easier to sell to constituents when it's going to benefit your local area. So that seems like a place that could move forward with bipartisan support.
Yeah, my reaction to that as I was sitting here listening is, what policy could bring the country together? I imagine my first reaction to that is that this is a very long journey. It is a long arc. It is one that we have been on for hundreds of years. And so I would say that there is no one single policy, but the thing that has really divided us, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is race and how that lines up with religion. And until we really deal with that and the history of that, not only the history, but the current reality of how that is operating in our society, then that's going to be a challenge. Because I think, it's funny, one politician I heard one time talk about this, and I want to say, and they said people vote their identities. That sometimes we think that people are referring to they're engaged in the policies and all that, and that's important. That's what politicians are doing, but they are responding to people on the ground in a lot of ways. And so we have to recognize that we have people who see themselves as fundamentally different. And we have a society that's been organized around the white power structure. And so until we really grapple with that history and that present, there is no real single sort of silver bullet that'll sort of address that. We have to be able to take this moment and see what's being laid bare in our society. And actually, I think COVID-19 is actually quite an interesting example of that, because viruses aren't discriminatory or biased. And yet what it's doing is it's revealing a biased system where people are getting it and dying at disproportionate rates, Black and brown people, and Black and brown people are being negatively affected by the solutions to COVID-19. Negatively. So we're seeing this in front of us. And until we really deal with that, there is no really single policy or set of policies that we will be able to address this. We've got to deal with that head on. And as our vice president and president-elect have promised, they're going to deal with systemic racism. It's a big one. Let's hope they can make some progress there. Yeah.
So we're getting ready to close, but I want to ask all of you to offer one reflection, and maybe you would keep in mind our students for a minute. What's one thing that makes you hopeful in this moment? Whoever wants to start.
Well, actually, I will build on what I just said. So one thing that people in my area we've been looking at are, There are a portion of people that voted for Trump in 2016, particularly white evangelicals. And we actually saw that that began to decline in 2020. Now, some people I talk to say, it didn't decline that much, 5%. What are you going to do? That's not a lot. But I say that's moving in a direction. Now, I'm just saying it's something that we're seeing some movement. And I think that matters and that's important. So we may see some change and some scaling down of some language and ways of thinking that are on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, I think all of you out there, including probably us on this panel, certainly me, are thinking, when is all of this going to be over? When is the election really going to end? And I think that there is really good news there, in spite of the infighting that's going on right now. None of the states right now have reported their official results from the election. That will be coming, or those will be coming in the next couple of weeks. Ohio reports its official results on Friday or Monday, and then they will be re-reported by the Secretary of State as kind of the capping of those official results. I think once that happens, we will find that things will move on. But of course, the challenge, and we've all spoken to this in one way or another, is that when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris take office on the 20th of January, they face a set of really, really difficult problems and difficult trade-offs that they have to make. And I think what's hopeful to me about that is that I think the public is ready to move on and to say, hey, we want problem solvers in Congress and in the White House who are going to deal with these problems and get us out of this pandemic, get us out of an economy that is stagnating and is really in trouble, get us out of problems with the climate, get us out of the kind of racial problems that have surfaced in terms of Black and societal treatment of African Americans and other minorities.
Ian?
Really just what I said the last time I talked was just we are at the verge of a big change, I think, when it comes to how we generate energy, how we really work within the Earth system, and we're going to have to figure that out sooner or later. And I think the next 4 years are going to be critical for that. And I think we have the tools to do it. And in terms of the science, it's probably never been a better time to be a scientist. I mean, the tools we have, the things we can do now, things that we couldn't even begin to guess we could do a few years ago. So for students out there, come on over to come enroll.
I knew there'd be some improvement going on here. Elizabeth.
So I am extraordinarily hopeful that we will, and I believe that we will have a coordinated federal response. Again, COVID doesn't respect boundaries, and the piecemeal way in which the states and even our local entities, public health entities, have had to individually come up with ideas and tackle COVID has really hampered our ability to really get a handle on the pandemic in the United States. And I think it's clear that that Biden believes that the CDC has a role and can carry it out well, and that it should be informed by public health professionals and medical scientists. And so I'm super excited, actually, to be able to do my work. I think a lot of us are in public health, and rein this in so that we can have a healthy economy and we can have healthy families and communities. So I'm very optimistic, actually.
And on that note, we're going to conclude today. I'm so grateful to all of the students, the faculty, the alums who tuned in for this, who offered such great questions. And I am especially grateful to my great colleagues here for their thoughtful contributions to this webinar. Thanks so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again soon. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.